The campus of Westbrook University, renowned for its academic excellence and prestigious faculty, had always been a place where the brightest minds came together. But for Jamal Carter, a junior in the economics program, it often felt like a battlefield. Every day, he walked the same paths, but the air was thick with the invisible weight of expectation and doubt. A weight that seemed to follow him wherever he went, reminding him that, despite his sharp mind and relentless drive, he was still just a black student in a sea of elite professors and high-achieving peers. That morning, however, was different. Jamal had walked into Professor Edwards' lecture hall early, hoping to get a head start on his notes. The room, still half empty, was filled with the faint murmur of conversations as students filtered in. But as he took his seat near the back, he overheard something that struck him to his core. "I give him 2 weeks," one voice sneered. "2 weeks," another replied. "I'm betting he won't make it through the semester. You saw his last presentation, he can barely string a sentence together." Jamal froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He glanced around the room. It was Professor Edwards, the brilliant yet notoriously condescending economics professor, speaking to his colleagues, Professor Stone and Professor Andrews, all of whom were deeply entrenched in their intellectual bubbles. They didn't think Jamal could hear them, but they didn't care. They were talking about him. "Are we really going to waste time with someone like him?" Professor Edwards continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "I mean, it's not about the work, it's about, well, you know. He'll never cut it here." The words echoed in Jamal's mind. "He'll never cut it here." They weren't just words, they were an indictment, a reflection of everything Jamal had fought against since arriving at Westbrook. The whispers of doubt, the looks of pity, the subtle ways in which he was told, without saying it directly, that he didn't belong. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained calm. His years of practice with this kind of casual racism and elitism had taught him how to mask his anger. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the rising storm in his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd felt like an outsider here, but today, something inside him snapped. He stood up from his seat, and without a word, walked out of the lecture hall. As he stepped into the cool morning air outside, Jamal couldn't help but feel a surge of determination wash over him. "I'll show them," he thought. "I'll show them all." The wind tousled his hair as he made his way across the campus. The towering buildings and lush green lawns of Westbrook stood proudly, almost taunting him with their sense of privilege. Jamal had always known that being here wasn't going to be easy. But this? This was personal. It wasn't just about acing his classes or securing a future for himself. It was about proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he belonged. In the quiet of the campus, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a text from Marcus, his best friend since freshman year. "Marcus, yo, you good? Heard you were in Professor Edwards' class this morning. Anything crazy happen?" Jamal smirked at the message. Marcus knew him well. He wasn't about to let his frustration with the professors slip under the radar. "Jamal, I'm fine. Just got a lot to think about." "Marcus, I get it. Don't let them get to you, man. You're smarter than they'll ever know. Just remember, they're just jealous." Jamal stared at the screen for a moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Jealous. He had heard that before from Marcus. It wasn't just that they were jealous of his intelligence, though. It was that they didn't want to acknowledge the fact that someone like him, someone from his background, could stand in the same room as them. They liked the narrative that only the privileged few could succeed at Westbrook. But Jamal was about to rewrite that narrative. "Jamal, I'm gonna outsmart them. Watch." Jamal put his phone back in his pocket and continued walking, his steps becoming more purposeful with each stride. He knew that if he wanted to rise above the mockery, he couldn't just prove them wrong in a single moment. He had to make them see him, not as the token black student they could dismiss, but as a force to be reckoned with. As the week went on, Jamal threw himself into his studies with a renewed sense of urgency. He pored over textbooks, research papers, and academic journals with a fierce determination. He wasn't just going to do the work, he was going to redefine what excellence looked like. It wasn't about fitting into their mold, it was about shattering their preconceived notions. Every time Jamal sat down at his desk, he thought about the professors who didn't believe in him. He thought about the long nights his mother had worked to make sure he could get this education, and the sacrifices she had made. "I won't let them win," he told himself. "I'm not here by accident. I'm here because I deserve it." The more he studied, the clearer it became, Jamal had a gift for understanding complex concepts in ways that went beyond the textbook. He didn't just memorize facts, he saw connections, patterns, and underlying principles that the professors seemed to overlook. The more he dove into the material, the more he realized that the key to outsmarting them wasn't just hard work, it was thinking differently, approaching problems from angles they never considered. It was Friday afternoon when Jamal got his first real test. The project for Professor Edwards' class had been assigned, an extensive research paper that would be graded heavily. Jamal knew this would be his chance to shine, but he also knew that the professors were waiting for him to fail. They expected it. They needed him to fail in order to validate their own biases. But Jamal wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He was going to exceed their expectations in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jamal sat back in his chair, the fire of determination burning in his chest. This was just the beginning. The professors may have mocked him now, but soon, they'd be the ones eating their words. And when the dust settled, it would be Jamal who stood at the top, outsmarting them all. Jamal Carter wasn't born into the kind of wealth that most students at Westbrook University flaunted. He didn't come from families that donated millions to the school or knew professors personally before even stepping onto campus. No, Jamal came from a small, tight-knit neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, where the sound of sirens often played a background track to his childhood. But even in the chaos of that environment, there was always a sense of community. Jamal's mother, Denise Carter, had always been his rock. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to make sure he had a roof over his head and food on the table. Her sacrifices weren't easy, but they were always made with love. Jamal remembered the long nights when his mother would come home exhausted from her shifts at the diner or the laundromat. Still, she never complained. Instead, she'd sit him down, help him with his homework, and remind him that no matter how hard life got, education was his way out. "You're going to be somebody, Jamal," she'd tell him, wiping the sweat from her brow. "You've got a brain, and that's your ticket. No one can take that from you." Jamal believed her, even if it seemed like the world was conspiring against him. As a kid, he had always been curious. He devoured books, everything from science fiction to historical biographies, and had a knack for understanding complex ideas that seemed far beyond his years. But growing up in Brooklyn, he was often told by others that he didn't belong. His neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where someone like him was expected to go to college, let alone to a prestigious one like Westbrook. There were no role models for him to look up to who had made it out, and that made the dream of a future at a place like Westbrook feel like a distant fantasy. Yet, despite the odds, Jamal's determination never wavered. He applied to every scholarship, every program, and every opportunity that could get him out of the neighborhood. It wasn't until his senior year of high school that he received his acceptance letter from Westbrook University, a moment that felt like a dream come true. But the reality of being one of the only black students accepted into this elite institution hit him hard. Westbrook wasn't just an academic challenge, it was a social one, too. Jamal quickly realized that he was different, and that difference was noticed in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he first arrived at Westbrook, Jamal felt the weight of every look. Some were kind, even welcoming, but many were laced with skepticism, doubt, and sometimes even subtle hostility. He became painfully aware of his race in a way he never had been before. In his classes, he was often the only black student, and outside of class, he struggled to make meaningful connections with others. His peers didn't see him as an equal. To them, Jamal was a project, a student who had somehow slipped through the cracks of their carefully curated world, a world that often seemed to be built on inherited wealth, privilege, and connections. But Jamal didn't let that stop him. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that both impressed and bewildered his professors. His professors at Westbrook, the ones who now mocked him behind his back, had never been faced with a student like him. Jamal didn't just learn the material, he dissected it, questioned it, and found new ways to approach it. He quickly gained a reputation for being brilliant, though not everyone saw his brilliance. To some, his way of thinking was too unconventional, too different. It was the professors in the economics department who were the most dismissive. Professors Edwards, Stone, and Andrews were part of the university's old guard, well-respected, highly published, and with a reputation for their intellectual elitism. They had a certain way of doing things, and anyone who didn't conform to their expectations was often pushed to the margins. Jamal, despite his obvious intelligence, found himself constantly fighting against the assumption that he didn't belong. But there was one person who always believed in him, Marcus Lewis. Marcus was Jamal's best friend, his confidant, and the one person who had been by his side since freshman year. Marcus, also from Brooklyn, understood the challenges Jamal faced better than anyone. They both knew what it was like to navigate a world that wasn't built for people like them. But while Jamal struggled to gain the respect of his professors, Marcus was a constant source of encouragement. He pushed Jamal to keep going, to not let the small-minded attitudes of their peers and professors define him. "Man, you belong here," Marcus would say whenever Jamal expressed doubt. "You've got something they can't even comprehend." Those words stuck with Jamal. They were a lifeline whenever the weight of racism and prejudice seemed unbearable. Marcus was always there to remind Jamal that his intelligence, his worth, was undeniable, no matter how many times the professors looked down on him or tried to dismiss his contributions. Marcus didn't care about the color of his skin or where he came from, he saw Jamal for what he truly was, someone capable of greatness. And that greatness, Jamal knew, wasn't just about proving people wrong, it was about changing the system that had always tried to hold him back. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't going to let the elite professors continue to mock him. He was going to make them see him for what he truly was, a force to be reckoned with. But to do that, Jamal knew he had to play the game differently. He started thinking about his approach to the class in a new way. Jamal knew he was intelligent, but he also understood that it wasn't enough just to outthink them on the surface level. He had to outsmart them in ways they wouldn't expect. This wasn't just about acing exams or assignments, this was about shaking their confidence in their own superiority. Jamal was going to prove that his voice, his mind, mattered just as much as theirs. With each passing day, the desire to outsmart the professors only grew stronger. Jamal knew it wasn't going to be easy. He'd face challenges along the way, and the road ahead would be tough. But he was ready. Ready to show them that no matter what they thought of him, he belonged at Westbrook just as much as anyone else. And so, with renewed determination, Jamal began to prepare for the ultimate test, the research project that would decide his future in the class. Little did the professors know, they were about to witness a student who wasn't just smart, but capable of something far greater. Jamal wasn't just going to pass this test. He was going to make them regret ever doubting him. As the days went by, the tension between Jamal and his professors only grew. Jamal knew what was coming. The research paper for Professor Edwards' class was fast approaching, and with it, the judgment of the professors who had already dismissed him as little more than a curiosity. He had to prove them wrong, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or overlooked because of their background. The deadline for the paper loomed ahead like a dark cloud, and Jamal's mind was consumed by it. He spent hours at the library, combing through academic journals, scribbling notes, and developing a hypothesis for his paper. He wasn't just going to focus on the assigned topic, which was on economic disparity in urban areas. Jamal wanted to go deeper, to challenge the very foundations of the economic theories the professors held dear. It was risky, but it was the only way to stand out, to show them that he didn't just regurgitate what they told him. He could push the boundaries of their comfort zone. Meanwhile, Professor Edwards, Professor Stone, and Professor Andrews continued to make their presence felt in ways that Jamal couldn't ignore. He had to walk past them almost every day in the hallway, their looks of indifference and condescension burning in the back of his mind. Sometimes they didn't even try to hide it. Professor Stone, the one with the most biting sarcasm, made a point of speaking to him in the halls, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "How's the research coming along, Jamal?" he asked one day, as Jamal was leaving the library. "Good," Jamal replied, keeping his voice steady. He wasn't going to give Stone the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. "Well, make sure you don't miss any of the basics," Stone continued. "It can be easy to get lost in the weeds if you're not careful." It was a thinly veiled jab, a reminder that Jamal wasn't expected to succeed, especially when it came to the kind of complex analysis the class required. Jamal just nodded, pretending not to be fazed by the insult, but inside, he could feel the anger bubbling up. Professor Edwards, on the other hand, was more subtle in his disdain. He often ignored Jamal's contributions in class discussions, or worse, would correct him with a thinly veiled critique of his alternative approach to the material. It was as though Edwards wanted to make sure that Jamal knew his place. The undercurrent of elitism was ever present, but it didn't matter. Jamal had already made up his mind. At night, as Jamal sat at his desk, the weight of it all pressed down on him. The loneliness of being one of the few black students at a school full of privileged individuals began to creep in, and the exhaustion from trying to prove himself over and over was starting to take its toll. But every time he thought of quitting, he thought of his mom. He thought of the sacrifices she had made for him to get to this point, the long hours at work, the constant battle to make ends meet. She never once doubted him, and he wasn't about to start doubting himself now. But then came a moment that would push Jamal to the edge. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Professor Edwards called on him in class, and Jamal had a theory to share. He had spent the past few days developing it, and he was confident in his analysis of a particular economic trend. He raised his hand, and Edwards, with a dismissive glance, gestured for him to speak. "I've been looking into the link between generational poverty and urban unemployment," Jamal started, his voice steady but firm. "Most economic theories suggest that poverty is a result of poor choices, but a closer examination reveals a pattern of systemic disenfranchisement that directly correlates with unemployment rates in these areas." Jamal watched as the room fell into a heavy silence. Professor Edwards' eyes narrowed, a subtle smirk forming on his lips. "Interesting," Edwards said, leaning forward. "But I'm afraid you're oversimplifying things. You see, the real issue here is personal responsibility, not systemic oppression. If people want jobs, they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, not wait for handouts from the government." The words were sharp, and they hit Jamal like a slap across the face. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were too afraid to speak up, others were too busy pretending they understood. But Jamal knew what this was. It was an attack. Edwards wasn't interested in hearing about his research or ideas, he was more interested in putting Jamal in his place. "Professor, I don't think that's the whole story," Jamal said, holding his ground. "There's a clear connection between historical disenfranchisement and the lack of opportunities for these communities. It's not just about individual effort." Professor Edwards' smirk faded slightly, but his tone didn't change. "Perhaps you should focus on the data, Jamal. Theories are all well and good, but without the right numbers to back them up, they're just ideas." Jamal could feel the eyes of the entire class on him. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He was frustrated, but more than that, he was hurt. Edwards wasn't even listening. He had already decided Jamal wasn't worth his time. But Jamal wasn't backing down. "The data supports my theory, Professor. If you give me the chance to present it in my paper, you'll see that the numbers aren't as one-dimensional as you think." For a moment, there was silence. Professor Edwards stared at Jamal, the weight of the room's tension hanging in the air. Then, without another word, Edwards turned to the next student, signaling the end of the conversation. The rest of the class went on as usual, but Jamal could feel the sting of defeat. He knew that moment had been his test, and he had failed. Or had he? As he left the classroom, he couldn't help but replay the conversation in his head. The doubt was there, but it was fleeting. He knew he had been right. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to prove. He didn't need to win Edwards' approval. He needed to make his own voice heard. That night, he sat at his desk, looking at the blank page of his research paper. He could have easily fallen into the trap of trying to fit into their mold, of making his work just like theirs, neat, structured, and easy to digest. But Jamal didn't want to be like them. He wasn't here to play by their rules. He was going to rewrite the narrative, and he was going to start with this paper. As he began typing, the words flowed freely, his thoughts finally coming together with a clarity he hadn't felt before. This paper wasn't just an assignment, it was his declaration of independence. He would show them that, no matter how hard they tried to box him in, he had a mind that couldn't be contained. With every word, Jamal could feel the tension building inside him. He wasn't just writing for a grade anymore. He was writing to change the game. As Jamal poured himself into his research paper, it felt as if the weight of the entire semester had finally converged on this one moment. He knew that his ideas would challenge the very foundation of the department's conventional thinking, and he could sense the eyes of his professors on him even though they weren't physically present. This was more than just an academic exercise, it was his way of asserting his place at Westbrook and proving to himself that he belonged. But writing the paper wasn't the only challenge. Jamal had to navigate the labyrinth of academic politics, power dynamics, and hidden biases that lurked beneath the surface of this prestigious university. It was like running a marathon while being weighed down by an invisible anchor. The professors weren't just scrutinizing his work, they were subtly creating an atmosphere of exclusion, making sure that Jamal felt isolated, alienated, and small. They didn't say it directly, but their actions spoke volumes. The less they acknowledged him, the more he had to prove. The first major test came when Jamal presented his initial draft to Professor Edwards for feedback. He had spent countless hours crafting every argument, fine-tuning every reference, and ensuring that his paper didn't just meet the minimum requirements but exceeded them. He needed Edwards to see that Jamal wasn't just a student trying to get by, he was someone who could shake the very core of their intellectual elitism. As Jamal entered Edwards' office, his heart raced. The professor's office was sterile, with rows of books lining the walls, but nothing about it felt welcoming. The air in the room was thick with superiority. Edwards sat behind his desk, glasses perched on the tip of his nose, glancing over the paper with a smug look on his face. "Well, Jamal," Edwards said, not bothering to look up from the paper, "let's see what you've come up with this time." Jamal's throat tightened. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that this was his moment. After a few silent minutes of reading, Edwards finally spoke, his voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "Well, the paper is ambitious, to say the least," Edwards said, tapping his pen against the desk. "But I think you're missing the mark here. Your argument on systemic oppression. It's too abstract. It's based on idealism, not reality. You need to anchor your paper in data, in hard facts, if you want it to be taken seriously in an academic context." Jamal forced himself not to show his frustration. He had anticipated this response, he had known that Edwards would dismiss his paper as impractical or ungrounded. The question was, how would he respond? "I appreciate your feedback, Professor," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "But the reality is that economic systems are designed to perpetuate inequality. The data I've gathered shows patterns of inequality that are impossible to ignore. If you look closely enough, it's clear that the issue is not just about individual choices. It's about the way systems have been set up to ensure certain groups remain at the bottom. Edwards raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the challenge. You're young, Jamal. You haven't seen the world the way we have. Economic theories are based on rational decision-making, not societal idealism. You can't just ignore the complexity of these systems because it fits your narrative. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. Edwards' dismissal wasn't just about the paper, it was a reminder of the narrow lens through which the professor viewed the world. But Jamal wasn't backing down. Professor, I understand what you're saying. But I've lived through the consequences of these rational systems. I've seen how they operate. The complexity isn't in the theory, it's in the people these systems affect. Edwards was quiet for a moment, clearly taken aback by Jamal's confidence. But then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he replied, well, I'll expect a revised draft by next week. Make sure you keep it practical, Jamal. This is academia, not social activism. As Jamal left the office, he could feel the sting of Edwards' words, but more than that, he felt the fire inside him grow. He wasn't going to let his paper be watered down just to satisfy Edwards' narrow views. He would rewrite it, yes, but he would stay true to his beliefs. Jamal had already put everything he had into this paper, and now he was more determined than ever to show the world what he was capable of. It was time to fight back, not just for himself, but for the countless students who had been silenced by the system. He knew he had to push even harder, and that meant going beyond what the professors expected. He needed to confront their intellectual arrogance head-on. Jamal spent the next several days revising his paper, incorporating Edwards' suggestions while still holding on to his core argument. But as he worked, a thought lingered in his mind: what if he could do more than just prove his point in this paper? What if he could expose the very biases embedded in the system? What if he could outsmart them, not just academically, but strategically? It was an idea that struck Jamal in the quiet moments of his research. If he could turn the tables on his professors, make them see the flaws in their own assumptions, he could accomplish something much bigger than acing a paper. He could make a statement, one that would echo far beyond this class. But to do that, he would need help. He couldn't do it alone. The first person he turned to was Marcus. Jamal trusted him more than anyone. Marcus had been there from the start, offering advice and support when Jamal needed it most. He knew Marcus would understand the stakes of this project, and he needed his input more than ever. The two met late one evening in their dorm, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of their laptops. Jamal explained his plan, to not just submit the paper, but to present it in a way that would challenge the professor's assumptions on a larger scale. You're going to confront them head-on? Marcus asked, eyebrows raised. That's bold, man. Are you ready for that kind of battle? Jamal smiled grimly. I don't have a choice. If I just write what they want, they win. But if I stay true to what I believe, I'm going to make them see me. I'm going to make them understand that their way of thinking is flawed. Marcus nodded slowly. I've got your back, Jamal. Whatever it takes, we'll make sure they know you're not backing down. With renewed energy, Jamal set the final version of his paper into motion. He would submit it on his terms, stubborn, unyielding, and unapologetically his. But there was still one final hurdle to cross: presenting it to the department. Little did Professor Edwards and his colleagues know, Jamal was about to turn this academic journey into a battle for something far bigger than grades. It would be a fight for respect, for justice, and for the recognition of voices that had always been pushed to the margins. The day Jamal submitted his revised paper was like any other, yet it felt like a silent turning point, a moment where everything could change. He handed in the final draft to Professor Edwards, feeling the weight of his words and the deep satisfaction of knowing that he had stayed true to his vision. The air in the department felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Jamal knew that no matter how his professors responded, he had already won by refusing to bow to their expectations. As he made his way back to his dorm, Jamal couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and anxiety. The paper was bold, challenging, and risky, but it was also a reflection of everything he stood for. He didn't just want to be another student passing through the system. He wanted to leave his mark, to show that a black student could challenge and reshape academic thought just as effectively as anyone else. The following week, the inevitable happened. Jamal's class received their grades for the research paper. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat down in the lecture hall, scanning the list of grades that had been posted outside Professor Edwards' office. As his eyes moved down the list, his stomach twisted. It was there, near the bottom of the page, Jamal Carter, C+. A wave of disbelief swept over him. A C+? After everything he had poured into that paper. After fighting against the odds, after challenging everything he knew to be true, he had been rewarded with a grade that felt like a slap in the face. He felt his breath catch in his throat, and for a moment, the room spun. Jamal stared at the grade, his mind racing as the hurt began to set in. This wasn't just a grade. This was a message. It was everything Jamal had feared. They were confirming what they'd already decided. He wasn't good enough. His ideas weren't valid. His voice didn't matter. He couldn't accept it, not after all the work he had done, not after all the personal sacrifices he had made to get to this point. Jamal had faced racism and discrimination before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a professor's judgment. It was a reflection of the academic system as a whole. It was a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, there would always be those who would judge him based on his background and not his abilities. For a moment, Jamal considered giving up. He could go through the motions, accept the grade, and let it slide as just another setback. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not this time. This wasn't just about the paper. This was about his future. This was about showing everyone, including himself, that he could rise above their expectations. The next day, he walked into Professor Edwards' office with a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just there to argue about the grade, he was there to confront the deeper issue. He had prepared himself for this moment, knowing that it would be uncomfortable, even hostile, but he had no choice. Professor Edwards, Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I saw the grade you gave me. And I want to understand, why. Professor Edwards looked up from his desk, his face neutral. You didn't meet the standards, Jamal. The paper was too theoretical. It lacked the practical application that this department values. Jamal didn't flinch. But I provided evidence to back up every claim I made. The data is there. My argument is sound. You didn't even acknowledge the points I raised about systemic oppression and the effects of historical disenfranchisement on economic systems. Edwards leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Your ideas are interesting, Jamal, but they're not grounded in the reality of the economic world we live in. You're too focused on social issues. Economics isn't about feelings. It's about numbers and facts. Jamal's heart raced, but he kept his composure. He had heard this before, the idea that social issues, particularly issues that affected marginalized communities, were somehow less valid than hard data. He had come to expect it, but hearing it from Edwards, who was supposed to be one of the foremost intellectuals in his field, stung more than he had anticipated. I see, Jamal said, his voice cool. So, facts and data are the only things that matter. The experiences of real people, people who live with the consequences of these systems, don't count. There was a long pause. Professor Edwards didn't respond immediately. Jamal pressed on. I've lived through this. I've seen the impact of these systems on my community. I'm not just writing about theories, I'm speaking from experience. If you can't see that, then I'm afraid we have a bigger problem. Professor Edwards' expression softened, though not in a way that indicated agreement. He was a man who was unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a student who refused to fit into the neat, controlled box he had constructed for him. "Jamal, you're a bright student. But you have to understand that this is academia. The world doesn't operate on personal experience alone. You can't expect to change things based on what you believe to be true. You have to play the game. That's how you succeed here." Jamal stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. Was this really the system he was fighting? A system that dismissed people like him, whose lived experiences didn't align with the narrow narratives of academia. He felt anger rise in him, but it wasn't just anger, it was a deep, unshakable resolve. "I understand, Professor," Jamal said, his voice calm but determined. "But I'm not here to play the game. I'm here to change it." For a moment, Edwards looked like he might argue, but Jamal turned and walked out of the office before the conversation could go any further. As he left the building, Jamal's emotions swirled inside him, anger, frustration, but also something stronger, hope. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. This wasn't just about one paper, one grade. It was about showing the world that he could stand up to an unfair system and prove that his ideas, his voice, and his experience mattered. That night, Jamal sat down at his desk, looking at his paper once more. He didn't need approval from Edwards or any other professor to know that what he had written was powerful. It was the truth. And soon, he was going to make sure the world saw it too. He wasn't done yet. The storm was just beginning. The days following Jamal's confrontation with Professor Edwards were a blur. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just between him and Edwards, but within himself. For the first time in a long time, Jamal felt as though he had finally found his voice. It wasn't just about proving himself to his professors anymore, it was about proving something to the world. But despite his newfound resolve, a sense of unease lingered. He knew he had made a powerful statement, but now he had to figure out how to take the next step. The grade, though disappointing, wasn't the end of the story. Jamal's eyes were set on something much bigger, making sure his ideas didn't just get buried in a sea of dismissive comments and mediocrity. He needed to reach people beyond the classroom, beyond the ivory tower of Westbrook University. He called Marcus the night after his meeting with Edwards. "We need to do something. Something bigger than just reworking this paper," Jamal said, his voice filled with a mix of determination and frustration. "If they're going to keep dismissing us, we have to fight back. I'm not going to let them push me aside." Marcus, always the voice of reason, took a moment to process what Jamal was saying. "What are you thinking? You can't just keep confronting them one by one. They're going to try and shut you down. They've been doing it for years. We need a plan." Jamal's mind was racing. The idea had been brewing in him ever since the confrontation with Edwards. He needed a platform, a stage where his ideas could be heard. Not just by Edwards, but by the entire academic community at Westbrook. "I'm thinking about going public," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'll organize a lecture. I'll present my research in front of the whole department. I'll challenge their views, and I won't back down." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke. "A lecture? Are you serious? You're talking about putting yourself in front of them and risking everything." "I'm serious," Jamal replied, his tone resolute. "If they won't listen to me in the classroom, then I'll make them listen outside of it. They can't keep pretending like we don't exist. Like our voices don't matter." Marcus sighed, clearly conflicted. "You're walking into a lion's den, Jamal. But I get it. I really do. You've been fighting this system since day one, and now you want to take the fight to them directly. Just, be careful. Don't let your emotions drive you into making a decision you'll regret." "I won't. This is bigger than me now," Jamal said, his voice filled with an unwavering sense of purpose. The next week, Jamal began putting his plan into action. He sent out invitations to the department heads, the professors, and even students who had expressed an interest in his work. The invitation was simple but provocative: a lecture on systemic inequality, challenging the traditional economics narrative. The response from the faculty was mixed. Some ignored the invitation altogether. Others, particularly the professors who had been critical of Jamal's research, were less than thrilled. But Jamal was undeterred. The lecture was scheduled for the following month, and in the days leading up to it, Jamal spent every spare moment preparing. He refined his arguments, pulled together additional research, and practiced his delivery. This wasn't just about presenting data, it was about telling a story, one that would shake the foundations of how they viewed economics, power, and race. The night of the lecture, Jamal stood in front of the packed lecture hall, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Students, faculty, and staff filled the seats. Some faces were skeptical, some curious, but Jamal knew they were all there for one reason: to see if he would succeed or fail. Professor Edwards was sitting in the front row, his expression unreadable. Jamal took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone," Jamal said, his voice steady. "Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Jamal Carter, and what I'm about to present to you is not just my research. It's a challenge to the way we've been taught to think about economics, race, and systemic inequality." The room fell silent as Jamal spoke. He started with his argument, one that had been carefully crafted to show how economic systems were designed to perpetuate inequality. He discussed how certain groups had been systematically disenfranchised, with historical and contemporary evidence to back up his claims. His words were sharp, deliberate, each point building on the last, like a rising tide. As he spoke, Jamal could feel the tension in the room. Some professors, like Professor Edwards, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others, particularly the students who had been skeptical of Jamal's research in class, appeared transfixed. Jamal could see that his message was landing. But it wasn't just the facts that resonated with the audience. It was the emotion behind them, the raw truth of Jamal's experience, his passion for justice, and his refusal to accept the status quo. He wasn't just another student spouting off statistics. He was someone who had lived through the consequences of these systems, someone who had been underestimated his entire life. As the lecture continued, Jamal turned his attention to the most controversial aspect of his argument: the notion that the current economic systems weren't just inefficient, they were inherently biased against marginalized communities. He cited case studies, historical trends, and personal anecdotes to drive the point home. "If we continue to operate under the assumption that these systems are neutral," Jamal said, "then we will continue to perpetuate the same injustices. It's not enough to simply study economics as a detached, theoretical subject. We must acknowledge the ways in which it impacts real people, every single day." There was a pause in the room, and Jamal could feel the weight of his words settle over the audience. He had made his point. Now, it was time to wait for the backlash, or the applause. Professor Edwards finally spoke, his voice cool but laced with an edge of tension. "You've made some compelling points, Jamal. But I still believe that your focus on social justice distorts the reality of economics. It's not enough to simply identify the problems. We need practical solutions, solutions that will work within the system as it exists." Jamal met his professor's gaze, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. "Professor Edwards, with all due respect, I'm not interested in working within a broken system. I'm interested in changing it." The room fell into a heavy silence. The tension was palpable, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air. He had not just made his case, he had made it in a way that forced everyone in that room to reconsider their preconceived notions. As Jamal finished the lecture and the crowd slowly filed out, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The fight was far from over. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: he had made them listen. The days after Jamal's lecture felt like a blur. He had poured everything he had into that presentation, his ideas, his passion, his very soul, and now, the aftermath was beginning to settle in. The applause had been polite but sparse, the murmurs of disagreement even more noticeable. Jamal knew that change wasn't going to come easily. He had expected resistance, but the full force of it was hitting him harder than he had anticipated. Professor Edwards, predictably, had been the loudest critic. After the lecture, Jamal overheard him speaking to a group of colleagues in the hallway. "He's a bright kid, but his approach is reckless," Edwards said, his voice cutting through the low buzz of conversation. "If he wants to be taken seriously in academia, he'll need to learn to temper his radical ideas. He's not going to get far pushing this social justice agenda in economics." The words stung, but Jamal couldn't afford to let them shake him. He had expected them. Edwards wasn't the only one who was displeased. Several other professors privately voiced their concerns, some questioning the legitimacy of Jamal's work, others accusing him of oversimplifying complex issues. Yet, Jamal had no intention of backing down. He had gone public for a reason, to show the world that his ideas had merit, and to force the system to confront its inherent flaws. But the pushback was relentless, and Jamal began to feel the pressure. In the days following the lecture, Jamal found himself increasingly isolated. His classmates, who had once been curious about his research, now seemed hesitant to engage. Some of them praised his bravery, but many others began to distance themselves, afraid of the backlash they might face by associating with him. It wasn't just the students and professors at Westbrook who were reacting negatively. Jamal's social media accounts, once a platform for sharing ideas and building connections, now filled with hostile comments and messages. People accused him of being divisive, of trying to stir up trouble for the sake of attention. Some even went so far as to question his qualifications, suggesting that a black student like Jamal could never understand economics the way a white scholar might. Jamal had expected some criticism, but the vitriol was overwhelming. The hate wasn't just about his ideas, it was personal. It felt like they were attacking his very existence, trying to prove that he didn't belong in the academic space. But amidst the negativity, there were also signs of support. A few students, those who had attended his lecture and found themselves moved by his words, began to reach out. They wanted to continue the conversation, to learn more about his research and share their own experiences. They told him that his lecture had opened their eyes to things they had never considered before. It was a small but powerful reminder that, even in the face of adversity, there were those who believed in what he was doing. Jamal also began receiving messages from alumni, former students of Westbrook who had long since graduated but still followed the department's activities. Some of them had faced similar struggles, and their words of encouragement were like a lifeline. They reminded him that the fight for change was never easy, but it was always worth it. Still, the pressure continued to mount. Jamal's academic standing at Westbrook was now on the line. He had been summoned to a meeting with the department head, Dean Watterson, the following week. The invitation, though polite, carried a clear undertone. This conversation wasn't going to be about praise. It was about Jamal's place within the department, and whether his approach to economics was truly academic enough to justify his future there. That morning, Jamal arrived at Dean Watterson's office with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had been through enough confrontation by now to know that this meeting could go either way. Dean Watterson was known for being pragmatic to the point of being merciless when it came to preserving the reputation of the department. "Jamal, thank you for coming," Dean Watterson said as he motioned for Jamal to take a seat. "I wanted to have a candid conversation about your lecture last week. It's clear you've generated quite a bit of discussion, but I'm concerned about the direction you're taking with your work." Jamal sat up straight, his heart pounding. He knew this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "But I believe the direction I'm taking is exactly what economics needs. We can't keep pretending that the system is neutral when it clearly benefits some and harms others." Watterson looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "I agree that inequality exists, Jamal. But your lecture, your approach, was divisive. It alienated some of your peers, and more importantly, it undermined the credibility of this department. Economics is about analysis, not activism. We don't make policy, we study it. Your lecture was more of a political statement than an academic one. Jamal's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his composure. If we only analyze systems without questioning their foundations, then what are we really doing? Justifying them? I'm not here to maintain the status quo. I'm here to challenge it. Dean Watterson leaned forward, his tone turning colder. I appreciate your passion, Jamal, but passion alone won't get you far in academia. We have standards here at Westbrook, and if you can't meet those standards, then you may not have a place in this department. Jamal's mind raced, but he refused to back down. I'm not asking for your approval, Dean Watterson. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove that my work is just as valid as any other research in this field. If you can't accept that, then maybe I don't belong here after all. For a long moment, the room was silent. Dean Watterson studied Jamal, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. Jamal, you're a smart student. I won't deny that. But understand this, you can't expect to change the world from inside the walls of this institution if you don't learn how to navigate it first. We can discuss your ideas, but you need to find a way to present them that aligns with the expectations of this department. Jamal stood up, his chest tight but his resolve stronger than ever. I'm not asking to change my ideas to fit into your department, Dean. I'm asking to change your department to fit my ideas. Without another word, Jamal turned and walked out of the office, leaving the silence of the room to settle in behind him. He knew this battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to back down. The war for his future, for the future of his ideas, was just beginning. Jamal spent the next few days consumed with the weight of his conversation with Dean Watterson. He had expected resistance, but the sheer force of the dean's words still stung. His position at Westbrook University was tenuous, and with each passing hour, the future seemed more uncertain. He found himself second-guessing his decisions, wondering if he had pushed too hard too soon, if there was a way to salvage his standing without compromising his ideals. It was on a quiet afternoon, a few days after the meeting with Watterson, that Jamal received a message that would change everything. The email subject line was simple, "Let's talk." The sender was Professor Langston, a senior faculty member in the economics department who had never been particularly vocal about Jamal's work, at least, not in the way that Professor Edwards had been. Langston had always seemed aloof, focused more on his research than engaging with students. He was the type of professor whose name was often mentioned with respect but never much enthusiasm. Jamal's first instinct was to ignore the message. After all, what could Professor Langston possibly want? However, something about the tone of the email intrigued him. Langston was a respected figure in the department, and if he was reaching out, it meant there was something worth discussing. He responded with a simple, "When and where," and soon found himself heading to Langston's office on the far side of campus. When Jamal arrived, Langston greeted him with a nod and motioned for him to sit. The professor's office was modestly furnished, a stark contrast to the opulent offices of some of the other professors. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with research papers, economics journals, and a collection of well-worn textbooks. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and coffee. It felt like a place where important conversations were had, conversations that, for Jamal, had often been out of reach. "Jamal, I've been following your work," Professor Langston said, his voice calm and measured. "And I must admit, I wasn't initially sure what to make of your lecture. It was bold. But I've spent the last few days thinking about it." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Langston leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "It means that, for the first time in a long time, you've made me question something. Something I thought I understood." I've spent my career analyzing economic systems without considering how they affect marginalized communities. I've never had to, because, frankly, I've never had to feel it. Jamal sat up straighter, a mix of surprise and curiosity filling him. Are you saying you agree with my lecture? Langston hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Not entirely. But the way you framed the issues, especially the intersection of race and economics, opened my eyes to something I hadn't considered. We, as economists, have become too comfortable with our assumptions, too distant from the real-world consequences of the systems we study. Jamal was taken aback. This wasn't what he had expected. So, you're saying you're willing to help me? To back me up in the department? Langston's gaze softened, and he leaned forward. I won't pretend to have all the answers, Jamal. But I'm willing to help you refine your approach. There's a middle ground here, a way to challenge the status quo without alienating everyone in the department. Jamal's mind raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for, an ally in a place he least expected it. But he was cautious. Langston had a reputation for being detached, for keeping his distance from any controversial causes. Why was he suddenly interested in Jamal's work? You're saying you'll support me, but on one condition. Jamal asked, narrowing his eyes. What's your angle here? Langston smiled faintly. No angle, Jamal. I've been in academia long enough to know that real change doesn't come easily. But sometimes, the loudest voices are the ones that can create the most noise, if they're backed by careful thought. Your lecture was emotional, which is good. But it needs to be more than that. If you want to make an impact, you need to build a stronger case, one that's undeniable. Jamal thought for a moment, then nodded. So, you're offering to help me revise my work, to make it more academically sound? Exactly, Langston said, his voice steady. I've got connections. If we can present your research in a way that appeals to both the traditional academic community and those who are more open to change, you might just get the traction you need. And I'll help you with that. But you have to be willing to listen. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected Langston to be this open, let alone this eager to help. But he also knew that this was his chance. If he could refine his research and present it in a way that made it both compelling and undeniable, he could change the conversation, not just at Westbrook, but in the broader field of economics. I'm in, Jamal said, determination flashing in his eyes. But I want you to know something. This isn't just about making a better argument. It's about shaking things up. If we're going to do this, we can't just play by their rules. We have to rewrite the rulebook. Langston studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We'll do it your way, Jamal. But remember, this isn't going to be easy. The department will push back, and so will the broader academic community. You'll need to be ready for that. I'm ready, Jamal said, the fire in his chest reigniting. Let's do it. And just like that, Jamal found himself with an unlikely ally in Professor Langston. Together, they began revising Jamal's research, strengthening his arguments, and honing his presentation. They worked late into the nights, exchanging ideas and challenging each other's assumptions. Jamal learned a great deal from Langston, not just about economics, but about the ways in which academic institutions could be both limiting and liberating. As their collaboration deepened, Jamal grew more confident in his ability to make a real impact. The academic world was full of barriers, but with Langston's support and his own unwavering determination, Jamal knew that he could push through them. The real battle, however, was still ahead. The department would have to be convinced, and Jamal would have to face the very professors who had doubted him from the start. But now, with Langston by his side, Jamal felt ready to take on the challenge. The stage was set for the next phase of his journey, and Jamal wasn't about to back down. The weeks that followed Jamal's meeting with Professor Langston felt like a blur of long nights, countless revisions, and new insights. Working together, they reshaped Jamal's research into something more compelling, more academically sound, and, most importantly, something that could not be ignored. Jamal's ideas had always been radical, but now they were grounded in solid, irrefutable evidence, an academic foundation that even the most skeptical professor would have trouble dismissing. Langston had introduced Jamal to a range of new sources, case studies, and economic theories, each one helping him refine his argument that economics, as it was taught and practiced, was inherently biased. He used Langston's guidance to strengthen his analysis of systemic racism in economic policies, linking historical discrimination to modern-day economic disparity. Jamal's work now had both academic rigor and the human element, what he had always felt was missing from the field. Through all of this, Langston remained a steady influence. While Jamal was still brimming with passion, Langston's approach helped him maintain focus. He showed Jamal how to anticipate counterarguments, how to approach tough discussions with nuance, and how to present his work with the authority it deserved. But beyond that, Langston provided the type of mentorship Jamal had never expected from a senior professor. He genuinely seemed to care about Jamal's success, not just as a student, but as a person and a scholar. Despite the progress, Jamal knew that the road ahead was going to be filled with challenges. The department was still full of resistance. Professor Edwards, in particular, had become more vocal in his disapproval of Jamal's work, and the whispers in the hallway were growing louder. But Jamal wasn't fazed. He had been prepared for this. After all, the greatest change never comes without resistance. Then came the email that would change everything. The department was hosting a special seminar to address divisive issues in the field of economics, and Jamal was invited to present. It was a significant moment, a chance for Jamal to prove once and for all that his research had merit. But it was also a test. If Jamal could convince the department, he would have solidified his place in the academic world. If he failed, his future at Westbrook could be over. The pressure was immense. Jamal found himself pacing in his dorm room the night before the seminar, rehearsing his presentation over and over again in front of a mirror. Langston had helped him perfect every slide, every line of his argument, but there was one thing that Jamal couldn't prepare for: the scrutiny. His every word, every idea, every gesture would be under a microscope. The weight of the department's judgment felt unbearable. But in the back of his mind, something shifted. Jamal realized that he had already won. He had the truth on his side. The facts, the evidence, the real-world impact of economic inequality, these were all undeniable. And no matter how many professors tried to shut him down, no matter how many people doubted him, the truth would always remain. That realization gave him the strength to push forward. The day of the seminar, Jamal stood in front of a crowded room of professors, administrators, and fellow students, the air thick with anticipation. He glanced around the room, noting the familiar faces: Professor Edwards, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, Dean Watterson, who seemed somewhat detached but vigilant, and Langston, who gave him an encouraging nod from the back. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He began his presentation by introducing his research, explaining how systemic racism in economic policies had shaped the present-day economic landscape. He made the case that economics, as a discipline, had long been disconnected from the realities faced by marginalized communities, and that it was time for the field to evolve. He outlined the history of redlining, discriminatory labor practices, and educational disparities, showing how these issues were not just relics of the past, but still deeply entrenched in contemporary policies. As he spoke, Jamal felt the weight of the room's judgment. He saw the skeptical glances exchanged between some professors, the raised eyebrows from others. But he kept going. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. When it came time for questions, Jamal braced himself. Professor Edwards was the first to speak. "Jamal," he said, his voice cool and condescending. "I have to say, I'm concerned about the direction you're taking here. Your arguments are bold, but they're oversimplified. Economics is a nuanced field, and what you're suggesting here could undermine the credibility of the discipline." We cannot simply toss out centuries of established theory based on your personal feelings about systemic racism. Jamal felt a surge of frustration, but he didn't let it show. Professor Edwards, he said, his voice calm but firm. This isn't about my feelings. It's about real-world data. We can't continue to pretend that the economic system operates in a vacuum, unaffected by history and societal structures. The evidence is right there, in the numbers, in the stories of people who have been left behind. Edwards' lips tightened, but he didn't respond. The room fell silent, and Jamal felt a brief sense of victory. For the first time, he was speaking on equal footing with the department's most powerful professors. Then, to his surprise, another voice spoke up. It was Professor Langston. I think Jamal's point is worth considering, Langston said, his tone thoughtful but not overbearing. We have spent so much time studying abstract models and theories, but we've neglected the very real impact these systems have on people. It's time to think about how our work affects those who have been historically excluded. Jamal's research challenges us to confront the reality of that exclusion, and we should take it seriously. The room went still. Langston had publicly sided with Jamal, and the impact of that was immediate. Several professors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even Dean Watterson seemed to take a more attentive posture. For the first time since this journey began, Jamal felt a wave of hope. He wasn't just fighting alone anymore. He had allies. And even if they were few, they were powerful. The seminar continued, but Jamal knew something had shifted. He had made his case, and now, there was no going back. As the seminar ended, Jamal packed up his materials, his mind racing. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but he had made a powerful statement, and that, for now, was enough. He was no longer just a student at Westbrook. He was a force to be reckoned with. The battle for his place in the academic world was far from over, but Jamal was no longer fighting alone. He had the support he needed to push forward, and with it, a newfound confidence that no one could take away. The days following the seminar were filled with anticipation. Jamal had delivered his argument, and the ripple effects of his words were already being felt across Westbrook University. He had stepped into the lion's den, and while the seminar had ended, the real battle had just begun. Professor Edwards remained a vocal critic. The following week, Jamal overheard a conversation in the faculty lounge between Edwards and another professor, Dr. Carson. That presentation was reckless, Edwards was saying, his voice full of disdain. If we allow these types of ideas to gain traction, the entire field of economics will lose its credibility. It's dangerous, Carson. Jamal's work is nothing more than political rhetoric masquerading as scholarship. Dr. Carson, who had always been somewhat indifferent to Jamal's ideas, replied, I'm not sure I agree. The way Langston spoke up, he's not one to back just any student. And Jamal's research, while unconventional, does offer some compelling points. Edwards scoffed. Compelling? It's an affront to years of academic tradition. We cannot, will not, let this student redefine what economics is about. If this continues, we're going to have a real crisis on our hands. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The stakes had just been raised. Edwards wasn't just doubting his research, he was attacking him personally. This wasn't about the data or the arguments anymore. This was about power, control, and who got to define what was valid scholarship. The next few days were a blur of whispered conversations, furtive glances, and tension in the hallways. Word had spread throughout the department about Jamal's presentation. Some were supportive, but most were critical. Edwards had taken to gathering a small group of professors who shared his view that Jamal's work was dangerous and politically charged. They began meeting in secret to strategize their next move, determined to discredit Jamal's work before it gained any more momentum. Jamal couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being watched, scrutinized at every turn. But there was a sense of resilience in him now. He had stood up in front of the department, and he wasn't about to back down. He had more to prove, not just to his critics but to himself. One afternoon, as Jamal was heading to his office, he was stopped by one of the graduate students, Clara Thompson. She was a quiet but sharp-minded student who had always been on the periphery, observing from the sidelines. "Jamal, I just wanted to say, your seminar was incredible," she said, her voice low but filled with sincerity. "I know things are tense right now, but I think you're onto something big." Jamal smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Clara. I appreciate that. I've been looking into some of the sources you mentioned, and I think you might have more allies than you realize," she continued, her tone conspiratorial. "There's a group of us, students and some professors, who believe in what you're doing. You're not alone in this." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Was there really a movement forming beneath the surface? Were people really starting to take his side? "Who are these professors?" he asked, lowering his voice. Clara hesitated before replying, "I can't say too much yet, but Professor Langston is definitely one of them. And there are others, some who've been quietly supportive of your work for months. But they're scared, Jamal. They know how dangerous it is to go against the grain here. So, it's going to have to stay quiet for now." Jamal nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. If there was a coalition of support forming, it could mean that his ideas weren't just a passing fad. There was a real chance for change, if only they could unite. But as the days wore on, the tension only grew. Jamal's classes had become more challenging to teach. His students were divided, some supportive of his message, others quietly critical. There were rumors that some faculty members were quietly advising students not to take Jamal's courses, labeling his lectures as too radical or too political. It was clear that the threat to his academic career was growing more real by the day. Despite this, Jamal refused to back down. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let a few obstacles derail him now. He had allies, both hidden and visible, and he would find a way to leverage their support. It was Langston who called him in for another meeting, this time in a small, unmarked office on the edge of campus. The professor's face was more serious than usual, a hint of urgency in his eyes. "Jamal," Langston began, his voice low. "I need to be upfront with you. Things are escalating faster than I anticipated. Edwards and the others are planning to present a formal challenge to your research at the next department meeting. They're going to try to have your tenure review stalled, and possibly push for your removal from the university." Jamal's chest tightened. "They're going that far?" Langston nodded grimly. "They're not just fighting your ideas, they're fighting your presence here. You're not just a student anymore, Jamal. You're a symbol of everything they've tried to maintain. They don't want to lose control of the narrative." Jamal exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What can I do?" Langston leaned forward, his voice intense. "You've got to be strategic now. The more you push back openly, the more they'll try to silence you. But you have the advantage. Your research is sound, now it's about positioning it in a way that they can't ignore. You need to build a coalition of support, both in the faculty and among the students. They can't cancel you out if you've got too many people behind you." Jamal took a deep breath, the fire inside him growing stronger. "I'm not backing down. But you're right, I need to be smart about this." Langston smiled, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of admiration and caution. "That's the Jamal I know. Just remember, this is going to get worse before it gets better." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Jamal worked tirelessly to build alliances, meeting with professors who had privately expressed support for his ideas. He also reached out to a few key students, including Clara, who was instrumental in rallying support among the student body. Together, they began to form a network, quietly working behind the scenes to strengthen their case. At the same time, Jamal continued to refine his research, not just to counter his critics, but to make it even more undeniable. He knew that his ideas would face resistance, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. If he could just get enough people to see it, he could turn the tide in his favor. The storm was brewing, and Jamal was preparing for the battle of his life. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going down without a fight. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The tension that hung in the air at Westbrook University had become almost palpable. Jamal could feel it at every turn, during his walks across campus, the whispers in the hallways, the cold glares from certain faculty members. The standoff between him and the more conservative elements of the economics department was reaching a boiling point. He had no illusions about the stakes. His career, his future, and the very foundation of his research were on the line. But Jamal wasn't alone in this battle. Langston's mentorship had been invaluable, but it was the growing network of students and faculty who supported him that gave him the strength to keep moving forward. Clara, the graduate student who had approached him earlier, had become one of his most important allies. She was instrumental in organizing a small but dedicated group of students who were committed to ensuring that Jamal's research wasn't silenced. They were working quietly, sharing resources, strategizing behind closed doors. Jamal knew that these students weren't just fighting for him, they were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for the acknowledgement that marginalized communities had a rightful place in academic discourse, that their experiences and histories deserved to be studied, understood, and addressed within the framework of economics. It wasn't just about one paper or one student, it was about challenging the very structures that had perpetuated inequality in academia. The days passed in a blur of late-night study sessions, meetings with allies, and preparations for the upcoming department meeting where Professor Edwards and his faction would formally challenge Jamal's work. The meeting had been scheduled for the following week, and Jamal was preparing for what would likely be his most crucial moment yet. He knew Edwards and his supporters would pull out all the stops to discredit him, but Jamal was determined to make his voice heard. On the day of the meeting, Jamal could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He had spent the entire morning rehearsing his arguments, carefully refining each point to counter the expected criticisms. His hands trembled as he walked to the faculty building, but he pushed the nerves aside. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. As he entered the building, he was greeted by Langston, who gave him a reassuring nod. "You ready?" the professor asked, his voice calm but filled with a quiet urgency. Jamal took a deep breath. "Ready as I'll ever be." Together, they walked to the meeting room, where the rest of the department was already gathering. The atmosphere was tense, with faculty members exchanging hushed words as they settled into their seats. Jamal could spot Edwards, who was sitting near the front, looking as smug as ever. He caught Jamal's eye and smirked, clearly confident that this would be the day he would finally discredit the young scholar. The meeting began with Dean Watterson introducing the topic of discussion, the future of Jamal's research and the growing concern that it was undermining the integrity of the department. Edwards was the first to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edwards began, his voice authoritative and condescending. "We are here today to address the clear threat that Jamal's work poses to the field of economics. His research, while bold, is fundamentally flawed. It relies on anecdotal evidence rather than rigorous, empirical analysis. It introduces political ideology into a field that is meant to be objective and neutral." Jamal clenched his fists, but Langston placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. The time had come. When Jamal's turn arrived, he stood up, his back straight and his mind clear. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several professors who had quietly shown their support for him. Then, he turned his gaze to Edwards, who was watching him with a smug expression. "I appreciate the opportunity to present my work today," Jamal began, his voice steady. "I understand that my research challenges traditional views, and I recognize that it's not easy for some of you to accept. But I stand by my findings. My work isn't just about the academic exploration of economics. It's about the lived experiences of people who have been systematically excluded from the very systems we study. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. You cannot separate economics from history. You cannot separate it from race. You cannot pretend that centuries of discrimination and exclusion have not left an indelible mark on our economy today. My research brings to light the truth that has been hidden for far too long. And I will not apologize for it. Edward sneered. This is precisely the problem, Jamal. Your work is not academic. It's an agenda. You're politicizing a field that requires objective analysis. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Jamal didn't flinch. With all due respect, Professor Edwards, objectivity is a myth. Economics is not some neutral science. It's a reflection of the values and priorities of the society that shapes it. And right now, that society is built on inequality, exclusion, and systemic racism. My research isn't about emotion, it's about exposing that truth. There was a murmur in the room as Jamal's words hung in the air. He could see that his argument was starting to resonate with some of the professors. Langston's nod of approval was all the encouragement Jamal needed to continue. I'm not here to disrespect the field of economics, Jamal said. I'm here to make it better. I'm here to make it more inclusive, more reflective of the realities we face in the world. The people who are left out of these conversations, the people who are hurt by these policies, they deserve to be heard. And my research is giving them that voice. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then, a voice came from the back of the room. It was Professor Mitchell, an older faculty member who had been largely silent during the proceedings. He cleared his throat and spoke. I have to admit, Jamal, your argument is compelling, he said, his voice measured. I've been in this field for decades, and I've always believed that economics should remain neutral. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that neutrality is a luxury we can no longer afford. If we want to understand the real world, we have to acknowledge the systems of power that shape it. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Mitchell's words were a breakthrough. If he could win over even one professor in the room, it could turn the tide in his favor. Edward scowled. Mitchell, this is absurd. You can't be seriously considering this. But Mitchell wasn't backing down. I think we should give Jamal's research more consideration. We might not agree with all of his conclusions, but his perspective deserves to be heard. The room was divided. Some professors were still firmly against Jamal's work, but others were beginning to see the value in his approach. Jamal could feel the shift happening in real time, and it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The meeting continued for another hour, with arguments for and against Jamal's research being debated. But by the end of it, something had changed. The department was no longer as united in its opposition to Jamal's work. The cracks in the resistance were starting to show, and Jamal knew that the tide was slowly but surely turning in his favor. As the meeting adjourned, Jamal and Langston walked out together. Langston clapped him on the back, a proud smile on his face. You did it, Jamal. You made them listen. Jamal's mind was racing. The battle wasn't over yet, but today had been a victory. He had stood his ground, and for the first time, the opposition had been forced to consider his perspective. This isn't just about me anymore, Jamal said quietly. This is about making sure that people who've been overlooked for so long finally get their due. I won't stop until that happens. Langston nodded. And you won't have to do it alone. You've got the support of more people than you know. The storm was far from over, but Jamal was no longer fighting in isolation. The winds of change were picking up, and he was ready to ride them all the way to the top. As Jamal walked through the campus in the days following the department meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening. It wasn't just the small victories, the murmurs of support, the gradual shifting of opinions within the department. No, it was something deeper. The battle had officially entered a new phase. Professor Edwards and his faction hadn't backed down, not by a long shot. They were still plotting their next move. But Jamal had proven that he wasn't a fleeting threat. He was a force to be reckoned with, and that meant the fight would be fiercer moving forward. The next week, Jamal was called into another meeting with Professor Langston. This time, it wasn't just a casual check-in. Langston's face was serious, and his eyes betrayed a sense of urgency. "Jamal, we need to talk," Langston said, gesturing to a chair. "This isn't just about your research anymore. It's about your future." Jamal sat down, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Langston leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Edwards and the others aren't going to let this go. They're planning to escalate. They've already contacted the dean's office and have made it clear they want your tenure review postponed indefinitely. Worse, they're pushing for your removal from the university entirely. They'll stop at nothing to discredit you." Jamal's heart sank. He had been prepared for resistance, but this was an attack on his very existence at Westbrook. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," Jamal said, trying to steady his voice. "But to remove me from the university? That's extreme." Langston nodded gravely. "It is, but it's also a reality. You've challenged the status quo in ways they can't ignore. The way they see it, you're not just a student anymore. You've become a symbol of everything they stand against. And right now, they have more power than you do." Jamal's mind raced, but he refused to be intimidated. "I won't back down. If they want to fight, I'll fight." Langston's expression softened. "I know you're not backing down. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about what you represent, the change you're trying to bring to this field, to this university. And that means we need to be strategic." Jamal paused, taking in Langston's words. "What do you suggest?" "We need to build our case, Jamal. You need to gather more support, not just from students, but from faculty who are willing to speak up publicly. The more people we can get on record, the harder it will be for Edwards and his group to push you out." Jamal nodded, his determination burning brighter than ever. "I've been doing that. Clara and a few other students are gathering support, and I've been meeting with some of the professors who've quietly supported me. But it's not enough. We need more." Langston's eyes gleamed with a mixture of admiration and caution. "Exactly. And you need to be prepared. They will try to paint you as a radical, a troublemaker, someone who's destabilizing the academic integrity of this university. They'll try to discredit you at every turn. But if you want to win this, you need to play the long game. This won't be decided in one meeting." Jamal sat back, considering Langston's words. He knew the road ahead was going to be difficult, but the idea of giving up wasn't even an option. The truth was on his side, and he had worked too hard to let it slip away. "I'll do whatever it takes," Jamal said, his voice firm. Langston smiled, his tone reassuring. "I know you will. But you also need to keep your focus. Don't get lost in the drama. Focus on the bigger picture. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for a future where more students like you, students from underrepresented communities, have a place in academia. A future where research like yours can thrive." Jamal's mind shifted into gear. This wasn't just a personal battle. This was about the legacy he would leave behind, the doors he would open for others who came after him. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but it was also empowering. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy sessions, both with Langston and the group of students who had been quietly supporting him. Clara remained a key player in rallying students, getting them to sign petitions, and organizing small meetings where they could discuss their shared vision for change. Meanwhile, Jamal worked to expand his network of faculty allies, meeting with those who had shown subtle signs of support during the previous department meeting. But even as the momentum grew, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still ahead. Edwards and his faction were playing a dangerous game, and Jamal knew that they wouldn't give up without a fight. The next department meeting was fast approaching, and Jamal had no doubt that it would be their most intense confrontation yet. One evening, as Jamal sat in his apartment poring over his notes, he received a call from Clara. "Jamal, you need to see this," she said urgently. "There's a video circulating on campus." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "What video?" "It's a recording of Edwards and some of the other professors talking about you," Clara said. "They're planning to smear your name even more. They're talking about discrediting you publicly, starting with an article in the campus newspaper." Jamal's blood ran cold. "Are you serious?" "Yeah. And it's not just Edwards. There are several other faculty members involved. They're already working on the piece. It's going to paint you as a radical, someone who's undermining the university's credibility." Jamal gritted his teeth. This was war. But he wouldn't be caught off guard again. "I'll handle it," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Thanks for letting me know." After hanging up, Jamal sat for a moment, processing the information. The stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for his integrity, for his reputation, and for the future of his research. He needed a counterattack, something that would expose the professors for what they really were. They couldn't just label him a troublemaker without facing the consequences of their own actions. And he had just the plan to do it. The calm before the storm was over. It was time to bring the fight to them. The morning air was crisp as Jamal walked across campus, his mind racing with plans. He had no intention of letting the professors who sought to discredit him get away with it. The video Clara had alerted him to was just the beginning of the battle. The game had changed, and Jamal was no longer on the defensive, he was taking the fight to them. The first step was to gather the evidence he needed. The video circulating among students was just one piece of the puzzle. Jamal knew that if he could expose the hypocrisy of Edwards and his colleagues, he could turn the tide in his favor. He wasn't just fighting for his own reputation, he was fighting for the integrity of the university and the principles of fairness in academia. Jamal and Clara had already begun working on a strategy to get the truth out in the open. The key was to expose the professors' attempts to suppress his research without them realizing that their actions were being tracked. They'd have to be meticulous, gathering public records, emails, and any other documentation that could prove the coordinated effort to undermine Jamal's work. But Jamal knew that simply releasing a few facts wouldn't be enough. He needed something bigger, something that would resonate with the entire university. He needed to make sure that his supporters, both faculty and students, understood the larger stakes at play, that this wasn't just about his research. It was about the very heart of academia, the idea that all ideas, especially those from marginalized communities, deserve to be heard. After a late-night meeting with Clara and a few of the students, Jamal decided on a bold move. He would take the video, a video that depicted Edwards and others conspiring to discredit him, and release it to the campus newspaper. But not just any release. He would use the video to tell his story. He would expose the attack on his work as part of a larger systemic issue within the department, an issue that needed to be addressed for the sake of progress and equity. The next day, Jamal sat down with the editor of the campus newspaper, Emily Torres, a senior journalism major who had been quietly supportive of his cause from the beginning. Emily had already covered a few of the rallies Jamal's supporters had organized, and she had shown interest in his research. Jamal knew he could trust her. "Jamal, I have to say, I'm impressed with the way you've handled everything so far," Emily said, leaning across the desk. "This isn't just a story about one professor and one student. It's a story about how institutions resist change, how they fight to keep their power." Jamal nodded. "Exactly. And it's not just my story. This is about the future of academia. I'm fighting for a world where more voices are heard, not just the ones that fit the status quo." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're going to need more than just the video to make this work. You need to expose the wider network behind it, the professors, the administrators. The whole system that's protecting these people." Jamal leaned forward, determined. That's the plan. I want to bring the whole thing to light. But it has to be done carefully. If I can show the entire university how this attack is a part of a much larger issue, it will be harder for them to sweep it under the rug. Emily grinned. I like the sound of that. You're not just exposing them. You're showing everyone how deep the problem goes. Over the next few days, Emily and Jamal worked together to create a comprehensive article. They combined the footage with evidence from Jamal's research, academic papers, public records, and interviews with faculty members who had been supportive of his work. The article would not just be an exposé, but a call to action. Jamal knew that the best way to change the system was to make it impossible for people to ignore the truth. The day the article was set to be published, Jamal sat in his dorm room, staring at his laptop screen. He couldn't believe how much had changed in just a few weeks. The quiet, passionate scholar who had first stepped onto the campus was now at the center of a firestorm. But this was the moment. He had put everything on the line, and there was no turning back. As the article went live, Jamal's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. His friends, his allies, even some of the more progressive faculty members sent their encouragement. But with every message came a looming sense of dread. The professors who were determined to silence him wouldn't take this lying down. They would retaliate. The first blow came the following morning. Jamal was sitting in the library, going over his notes for his next lecture, when he was called into Dean Watterson's office. The tone of the message was curt and cold, an official summons to meet about his recent actions. When Jamal arrived, he found Dean Watterson seated behind his large desk, flanked by Professor Edwards and another member of the faculty. Jamal stood tall, his posture firm as he met their gaze. Jamal, the dean said, his voice clipped. I must say, I am deeply disappointed in your actions. This article you've written, the video you've shared, it's caused a significant disruption in the department. Jamal didn't flinch. I'm sorry if my work has made some people uncomfortable, but I didn't do this to cause chaos. I did it to expose the truth. Edward scoffed. This isn't about the truth. This is about you trying to destroy our department, undermine years of hard work, and make a mockery of everything we've built here. Jamal stood his ground. No, Professor Edwards. This is about exposing the way the department has suppressed research that challenges the status quo. It's about making sure the voices of students from all backgrounds, especially those who've been silenced for so long, are finally heard. The dean's expression hardened. This isn't a debate. You've made your position clear. But now you must face the consequences. Your actions are damaging to the university's reputation. We are considering a review of your position here. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained composed. You can review my position all you want. But the truth won't go away. My research won't go away. I'm not backing down. For a moment, there was silence. Then the dean leaned forward, his tone shifting to something more menacing. You've made a grave mistake, Jamal. You've picked a fight you can't win. And we will make sure that you learn that lesson. Jamal nodded, unfazed. We'll see about that, Dean. As he walked out of the office, Jamal knew this wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. The university was going to come after him, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The fight had just escalated. And Jamal was ready for whatever came next. The next few days were a blur of meetings, emails, and whispered conversations in the halls of Westbrook University. Jamal could feel the tension mounting as more and more students and faculty began to take sides. His article had gone viral on campus, circulating through every department and student group. But with the support came resistance, stronger than he had expected. Dean Watterson's threat had been clear, but Jamal wasn't afraid. If anything, it had only fueled his resolve. He knew that the fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student who had ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or silenced in academic spaces. Jamal had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. And symbols, as history had shown, had the power to change the world. But that didn't mean the road ahead was easy. As Jamal spent more time strategizing with his allies, Clara, Langston, and a growing number of faculty supporters, he began to realize just how deep the opposition ran. Professor Edwards had turned the entire department against him, convincing many of his colleagues that Jamal was a dangerous threat to the academic integrity of the university. The smear campaign had begun in earnest, and now Jamal was fighting an uphill battle. On one particularly grueling afternoon, Jamal found himself seated in Langston's office, trying to make sense of the situation. The professor's face was tight with concern as he looked over a stack of emails from the administration. "They're moving fast," Langston said, shaking his head. "I've seen some of the communications from the higher-ups. They're planning a formal review of your case, and they've made it clear that they want to pressure you into backing down." Jamal exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling up. "They think they can scare me into quitting. They don't understand that I've already come this far. I won't back down." Langston looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I don't think they're just trying to scare you. They're trying to isolate you, Jamal. And that's what worries me." Jamal frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Langston leaned forward. "What's happening isn't just about your research anymore. This is personal. Edwards and his allies are trying to paint you as a lone wolf, someone who's disrupting the department for no reason. If they succeed in isolating you, it'll be that much harder to rally the support you need." Jamal absorbed Langston's words, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He had always known that fighting for change wouldn't be easy, but the thought that his very presence in the department could be undermined so systematically, it stung. "I don't want to be alone in this," Jamal admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But the more I try to fight back, the more they try to tear me down. It feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Langston gave a small smile, his voice warm with reassurance. "You're not alone, Jamal. You have people who believe in you. But you have to be strategic. You can't let them control the narrative." Jamal nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "I won't. But I need to hit them where it hurts. I need to make it clear that this fight isn't just about me, it's about the future of academic freedom." Langston's eyes lit up. "Exactly. This isn't just a personal vendetta. This is a matter of principle. If you can frame it that way, if you can show that this is about something much larger, you might just be able to turn the tide." That was the moment when it clicked. Jamal's research, his journey, his fight, it wasn't just about him. It was about the principles of equity and justice in academia. He wasn't just an individual student trying to get ahead, he was a representative of a larger movement, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. The next step was clear. Jamal needed to get the message out, loud and clear. He needed to frame this as a battle for the soul of academia, where ideas and research from marginalized communities were just as valuable as those from established, predominantly white scholars. And that message couldn't just stay within the walls of Westbrook University. In a series of meetings with Clara and his growing network of student supporters, Jamal began to devise a plan. They would organize a massive protest on campus, a public display of solidarity that would send a clear message: Jamal's fight was the fight of every student who had ever felt silenced or excluded. But Jamal knew that he couldn't rely solely on the support of students. If he wanted to change the narrative, he needed the faculty on his side, too. He reached out to Professor Langston and several other faculty members who had quietly supported him in the past. Together, they crafted a petition, one that would appeal to the heart of the university's mission. The petition would call for a review of the department's practices and a commitment to diversity and inclusivity in research. If they could get enough signatures from respected professors, it would be a game-changer. As the days passed, the campus seemed to be brimming with anticipation. Word of Jamal's plans had spread, and both students and faculty were watching closely. Edwards and his allies, however, were not taking this lying down. Rumors started to circulate that they were preparing a counter-protest, one that would denounce Jamal's methods and cast him as a radical. Jamal could feel the tension building, but he refused to be intimidated. He had already faced worse, why would he stop now? His belief in the cause had only grown stronger, and with Clara, Langston, and his ever-growing network of supporters by his side, Jamal knew that he could win this fight. But the stakes were higher than ever. The protest day arrived, and Westbrook University's campus was buzzing with activity. Students were gathering in the quad, many of them wearing T-shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Academic Freedom for All" and "Equity in Research." The energy was electric. Jamal stood at the center, his heart pounding as he watched the crowd assemble. Clara came up to him, her face lit with excitement. "This is it, Jamal. We've got this." Jamal gave her a tight smile. "We're not just fighting for me. We're fighting for every student who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter. This is bigger than us." But as Jamal spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real battle was just about to begin. As he looked toward the horizon, he saw Edwards and his faction preparing for their own counteraction, and Jamal knew that the next few days would be the defining moment of his journey. It was a battle that would determine not only his future but the future of countless others who dared to speak truth to power. And Jamal was ready for whatever came next. The sun hung high over Westbrook University's campus as Jamal stood at the front of the gathering crowd. His heart beat in rhythm with the chants from the students around him, their voices filled with determination. "Equity in research," they cried, their collective energy rising. But beneath the outward show of unity, Jamal couldn't shake the tension coiling in his chest. He knew that today was more than just a protest, it was the beginning of a battle that would change everything. Beside him, Clara was handing out flyers, rallying students to sign the petition. Langston had been meeting with faculty members all morning, gathering support from as many as possible. The energy was contagious, but Jamal remained focused. He had one goal: to ensure that the university leadership understood that this wasn't a fight he could be silenced from. The message needed to be clear, it wasn't just about him, but about everyone who had ever felt their voice was disregarded. But there was one looming obstacle in his way: Professor Edwards and his loyal colleagues. Jamal had seen them gathered across the quad earlier, preparing their own counter-protest. He knew what was coming. They were going to try to tear this down before it gained any more momentum. Jamal could feel their eyes on him, their cold stares like daggers, but he wasn't going to let them intimidate him. As much as the professors wanted to brand him as an outsider, Jamal knew that this was his moment. The future of academic freedom and inclusivity was on the line. "You've got this, Jamal," Clara said, offering him a reassuring smile as she returned to his side. "We've all got your back." Jamal gave a tight nod. "Thanks, Clara. But this is more than just today. This is about changing the entire system." The protest kicked off with a passionate speech from Jamal, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He spoke about the importance of diverse voices in academia, how institutions like Westbrook needed to do more than just pay lip service to inclusion, they needed to act. His words were met with cheers and applause from the crowd, but Jamal's eyes kept darting to the other side of the quad, where Edwards and his faction were gathered. The tension in the air was palpable. Both sides were waiting for the other to make a move. And it didn't take long for the clash to begin. A group of students from Edwards' camp, many of them quietly supportive of Jamal just a few weeks ago, suddenly began shouting slogans of their own. "Academia is not a playground for political agendas," one of them yelled, the words cutting through the air. The protesters on Jamal's side didn't flinch. In fact, they grew louder, their chants rising to drown out the opposition. The air crackled with the potential for conflict. Professor Edwards stepped forward, his voice booming over the crowd. "This is exactly what I've been warning you about, Jamal. This is a disruption, not a movement. You're poisoning the minds of these students. Jamal's pulse quickened. He could feel the heat of the moment building to a boiling point. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. You don't get to decide who belongs in academia, Edwards. You don't get to silence voices just because they make you uncomfortable. This is about creating space for everyone to be heard. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the shouting started again, louder this time, as more students from Edward's side began to push forward, challenging the protesters. The line between the two factions had been drawn. Jamal could feel the heat rising. This wasn't just a disagreement over academic theories anymore. This was a battle over power, a battle over who controlled the narrative. And right now, Jamal was standing at the center of it all. But Jamal wasn't just going to sit back and let it all fall apart. He had a plan, and it was time to execute it. Everyone, listen up. Jamal called out, raising his voice above the chaos. This is about more than just today. It's about ensuring that the voices of those who've been marginalized in this university are finally heard. No more silencing, no more exclusion. This is our time. The crowd seemed to respond to his words, their chants growing louder, more unified. But Jamal knew it was only a matter of time before the administration took action. Dean Watterson would not let this slide. The university couldn't afford for this to become a national story, and Jamal knew that the pressure was mounting on him from all sides. As if on cue, a line of campus security officers appeared at the edge of the protest. Jamal could see the officers' tense faces, clearly unsure of how to handle the escalating situation. They had been called in to maintain order, but Jamal could tell they were preparing to intervene if things got out of hand. He took a deep breath. This was the moment. He couldn't let fear guide him now. With a sudden movement, Jamal stepped forward, addressing the security officers. This protest is peaceful. We have every right to be here, to make our voices heard. If you're going to do anything, it should be to protect our right to speak up. The officers hesitated for a moment, their eyes flicking between Jamal and the angry students behind him. But it was clear that they were caught between two warring factions. If they stepped in, they risked escalating the conflict; if they didn't, they risked appearing weak. But Jamal wasn't interested in waiting for them to make the call. He turned back to the crowd, his voice now commanding and resolute. This is about more than just fighting for my place here. This is about fighting for every student who has been overlooked or marginalized in this university. If they want to shut us down, they'll have to shut down every one of us. And then it happened. The moment the security officers made their move to separate the two groups, Jamal was prepared. As they advanced, he made a clear statement, uniting his supporters into one strong collective. We are not leaving. Not until they hear us. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jamal knew that, no matter how tense things got, there was no turning back now. But as security encircled the crowd, Jamal's mind raced. He knew that the response to this protest would determine everything. The university would either back down and allow the students to be heard, or they would escalate their tactics to shut him down once and for all. Jamal had made his stand. Now it was up to the administration to decide how far they were willing to go. And as the security officers closed in, Jamal realized something: he had never felt more certain of his purpose. The protest was over, but the battle was far from won. The sound of chanting had faded, replaced by the hum of tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. As the crowd dispersed, students left the quad in groups, some still buzzing with the adrenaline of what they had just participated in, while others were quieter, contemplating the storm they had just ignited. Jamal stood alone for a moment, watching the scene unfold, his mind racing. What would happen next? He had expected the university to respond, but the sheer speed with which things escalated shocked him. Less than an hour after the protest had ended, Jamal received an email from the dean's office. The subject line was stark: immediate suspension pending review. His stomach dropped as he clicked open the message. It was a formal notice, informing him that, effective immediately, Jamal's access to his research and the campus had been suspended until further notice, pending an investigation into the events that had transpired. Jamal sat down on the nearest bench, staring at the email. He could feel his breath catch in his chest. This was it, this was the university's retaliation. They couldn't take the fight to him directly, so they were going to strip him of everything that had given him purpose. His research, his career, and his future. It was the blow he had feared most, but even then, Jamal wasn't ready to back down. Not now. He was snapped out of his thoughts when Clara appeared at his side. Her expression was somber, but there was a fire in her eyes. "They suspended you, didn't they?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. Jamal nodded. "Yeah. They want me out. They're trying to silence me." Clara shook her head, disbelief written on her face. "This isn't just about you anymore, Jamal. This is about everything they've been getting away with. This is their attempt to shut down anyone who challenges their power. But they're not going to win this." Jamal exhaled slowly. He knew Clara was right, but the weight of what he was facing was overwhelming. It was one thing to fight for change, but it was another thing entirely to do it with everything on the line. His career, his education, and his future were now at risk. They were trying to break him, but Jamal wouldn't let them. "Not now." Jamal started, but Clara cut him off. "You can't give up. This isn't the time to back down. It's time to take the fight to them, Jamal. If they think they can suspend you and make you disappear, they're wrong." Jamal met Clara's gaze, a flicker of resolve igniting in his chest. She was right. He couldn't give up. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to let them bury him. Jamal had a purpose, and the fight was just beginning. Over the next few days, the news of Jamal's suspension spread like wildfire. Campus news outlets, student groups, and even local media began covering the story. The backlash was swift. Jamal became a symbol, not just for the cause of academic freedom, but for anyone who had ever been silenced by a powerful institution. Support for him poured in from every corner of the university, and beyond. But as the pressure mounted, so did the resistance. Professor Edwards and his allies wasted no time in rallying behind the administration's actions. They painted Jamal as a troublemaker, a student who had disrupted the peace of the university and undermined its core values. The smear campaign was well underway, and it was clear that the stakes were rising. The more Jamal fought back, the more they tried to bury him. Despite the mounting pressure, Jamal knew he couldn't afford to sit idly by. He had to act. But his first move was not to engage in a war of words or try to argue with the administration. He had to go above their heads and prove that what they were doing wasn't just about him, it was about the rights of all students. Jamal reached out to Clara, Langston, and a few faculty members who had quietly supported him. Together, they began to organize a larger campaign, a petition to the university's board of trustees. The goal wasn't just to get Jamal reinstated, it was to demand a full review of the university's academic policies, particularly concerning diversity and inclusion. They needed to expose the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester under the guise of academic tradition. As the days passed, Jamal's movement began to gather momentum. More faculty members signed the petition, including some of the most respected professors on campus. Students, too, rallied behind him, attending meetings, circulating petitions, and spreading the word. Jamal's suspension had done more than silence him, it had sparked something bigger. The battle wasn't just about one student, it was about the future of academia itself. But there were still obstacles to overcome. Dean Watterson and Professor Edwards continued to exert their influence, trying to shut down the movement at every turn. They used their power to control the narrative, spinning the protest as an act of insubordination, a dangerous challenge to the established order. And the more they painted Jamal as the villain, the more divided the campus became. Then, just as Jamal thought the situation couldn't get worse, he received a phone call that sent a chill down his spine. It was from one of his sources within the administration, someone who had been feeding him information for weeks. "Jamal, you need to listen carefully," the voice on the other end said, low and urgent. "They're planning to expel you. Not just suspend you. They're going to expel you if this petition reaches the board." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Expulsion? It was one thing to be suspended, it was another thing entirely to be kicked out of the university, permanently. They were escalating things. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. "Do you have proof?" Jamal asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I can't get you proof yet, but it's happening. They've already started the paperwork. They're just waiting for the right moment to drop the hammer." Jamal's mind raced. This wasn't just about his future, it was about the future of every student who ever questioned the status quo. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. If they thought they could expel him and silence the movement, they were sorely mistaken. "I won't let them win," Jamal said, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere." He hung up the phone and turned to Clara, his resolve clearer than ever. "They're planning to expel me." Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. "Then it's time we take this fight to the public. We need to make sure they can't ignore us anymore." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was yet to come. The university might be trying to silence him, but Jamal had come too far to back down now. He wasn't just fighting for his future anymore. He was fighting for the future of every student who had ever been overlooked, undervalued, or silenced. And he wouldn't stop until the truth came out. Jamal had never expected things to escalate so quickly, but now the battle was no longer confined to the walls of Westbrook University. It had gone public, and the stakes were higher than ever. The university had suspended him, but their decision to expel him was something that could no longer be contained within the ivory towers of academia. The story was everywhere, social media, local news stations, and national headlines. Jamal had become the symbol of a fight much larger than himself, one that captured the growing concern over diversity, inclusion, and free speech within academic institutions. It had been less than a week since the protest, and Jamal's story had gone viral. Supporters from across the country rallied behind him, sharing their own experiences of discrimination or being silenced in academic spaces. #JusticeForJamal trended on Twitter, and petitions calling for his reinstatement amassed thousands of signatures within hours. Faculty members at other universities reached out in support, pledging to stand with him against the growing tide of administrative oppression. Despite the outpouring of support, however, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of resistance. Professor Edwards and his colleagues continued to vilify Jamal, framing him as a radical agitator determined to tear down the foundations of academic tradition. They painted him as a disruptor, an outsider who was threatening the stability of the university. Their words were sharp, and they wielded their influence with a calculated precision. But the more they attacked Jamal, the more the movement grew. And that was something they hadn't anticipated. Late one evening, Jamal sat in his small apartment, his laptop open before him. He scrolled through social media posts, the flood of support overwhelming yet humbling. Clara had just finished giving an interview with a local news station, and Langston had been fielding calls from alumni who wanted to get involved. Jamal sighed and leaned back in his chair. The fight was far from over, but the response from the public had been encouraging. What was becoming clearer with each passing day was that the university's attempt to silence him had triggered a wave of solidarity from students, faculty, and activists alike. But there was still one more thing Jamal needed to do: he had to confront the university's leadership head-on. "We need to go to the board," Jamal said, his voice breaking the silence as Clara entered the room. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You want to go straight to the board? As in the board of trustees? They'll eat you alive." Jamal nodded. "If I don't go to them, they'll just keep trying to bury this. We need to force their hand." We need to show them that this isn't just about me, it's about the system they've been protecting for too long. Clara looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with concern but also a sense of determination. All right. But we're doing this together. I'll be there with you. Langston had already promised to lend his support, and Jamal knew he needed every ally he could get. The board of trustees was powerful, many of them were wealthy alumni who had built their fortunes in business and finance. They had no interest in student protests, and they certainly had no patience for Jamal's cause. But that didn't matter. If Jamal was going to win, he needed to expose their hypocrisy. He needed to show the world what was really at stake. The following week, Jamal and his small group of supporters made their way to the university's central administration building. A protest was already gathering outside as more students and activists arrived to rally for Jamal's cause. Inside the building, security was tight, but Jamal's presence was unmistakable. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation as the group was escorted to a conference room where the board of trustees had assembled for a special meeting. Jamal's heart raced as he entered the room. The board members sat around a large wooden table, their faces cold and stern. Dean Watterson was present, seated at the head of the table with Professor Edwards to his right. The tension in the room was palpable. Jamal had been here before, but never like this. He took a deep breath, and with Clara and Langston by his side, he stepped forward. The moment had arrived. "I'm Jamal Carter," he began, his voice steady, though the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. "And I'm here because this university, which claims to stand for education, equity, and inclusion, has chosen to silence me. And not just me, many others like me who've come before and after." A murmur ran through the room, but Jamal pressed on. "I'm not just fighting for my right to remain here, I'm fighting for every student who has been marginalized, whose voice has been dismissed, whose ideas have been crushed under the weight of privilege and tradition. The suspension, and now the threat of expulsion, is your way of maintaining control over a system that needs to change. And I will not let that happen." There was silence for a moment. Jamal could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. Dean Watterson finally spoke, his voice icy. "Mr. Carter, your actions have disrupted this university. You've ignored the rules and have been a poor representative of the student body. The issues you're raising have merit, but the way you've gone about it is unacceptable. You've shown no regard for the people you've offended. There are consequences for such behavior." Jamal refused to back down. "I didn't ask to be offended, Dean. I didn't ask to be marginalized. I didn't ask for this fight, but now that it's here, I'm not going to sit down. You've built a system that works for some but not for all. It's time for change." Professor Edwards, who had been sitting silently until now, leaned forward, his expression venomous. "You're just a student, Carter. You think you can come in here and tell us what's wrong with the system? You don't understand the intricacies of academia. You don't understand what it takes to build a respected institution. You're making it worse for everyone." Jamal's eyes narrowed. Respect for the institution means nothing when that institution leaves out half of the people it's supposed to serve. It's not just about academia, it's about fairness, about equal opportunities, and about making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. If you can't understand that, then maybe you don't deserve to be in charge of it. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Dean Watterson's face was tight with anger, but Jamal could see something else in the eyes of the other board members, an uncertainty. They were used to control. Used to silence. But Jamal wasn't backing down, and he wasn't the only one. As the meeting continued, Jamal's words resonated more than he could have imagined. The board might not have been swayed immediately, but the cracks in the system were starting to show. He could see it in their faces, they knew things were changing. And Jamal wasn't going to stop until the world saw it, too. After a long and tense meeting, the board adjourned with no immediate decision. But as Jamal walked out of the room, he knew something had shifted. The fight had only just begun, but now it wasn't just about one man's fight for justice, it was about a movement that could change everything. The days following Jamal's confrontation with the Board of Trustees were filled with uncertainty. The meeting had ended in a tense silence, with no clear resolution. Jamal knew that while the battle hadn't been won, the real work was only just beginning. The momentum was on his side now, but so was the mounting pressure from the administration, and the stakes had never been higher. As he sat in his apartment, scrolling through the daily updates and reactions, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the precipice of something much larger than he could have anticipated. The media had continued to cover his case, but the narrative was beginning to shift. More stories about Jamal were coming out, not just from students but from influential faculty members, respected scholars, and even activists who had been following the situation closely. Jamal wasn't just a student anymore. He was becoming a symbol, a figurehead for something far more significant than just the issue of his suspension. But with that symbolism came more responsibility, and more danger. Jamal knew that as much as he had gained support, there were just as many people working behind the scenes to discredit him, to silence him, and to crush the momentum he had fought so hard to build. The administration was going to escalate their efforts. He could feel it. It was on a crisp Thursday morning when Clara, Langston, and Jamal gathered in their usual spot at a local coffee shop to discuss their next move. The pressure had increased tenfold in the past few days. Rumors of a possible vote to expel Jamal had circulated through campus, and the social media storm was only growing. "Here's the deal," Clara said, looking over her laptop screen. "We're getting national attention now. This isn't just about Westbrook anymore. It's about every university that's ever tried to sweep these issues under the rug." Jamal nodded but wasn't entirely convinced. "Yeah, but we're still up against the top brass of the university. The trustees aren't going to just cave in because of a few viral hashtags and protests." Langston, ever the strategist, tapped his fingers on the table. "That's true, but we're not just fighting the administration anymore, Jamal. We're fighting a system, and systems are vulnerable when you shine enough light on them. That's what we need to keep doing, keep applying pressure. But we also need to find a way to hit them where it hurts. And that's with the board's bottom line, money." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" Langston smiled, the glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "I'm suggesting we start talking about the real power behind the board, the donors. These trustees are largely dependent on their wealthy alumni and donors for funding. If we can make it clear to them that their association with an institution that's suppressing voices of equality and justice isn't good for their brand, we'll have leverage." Clara chimed in. "Langston's right. If we get some key donors to speak out, it could shake the board's position. We might even be able to use that pressure to sway their vote on your expulsion." Jamal leaned back in his chair, the idea starting to sink in. "So, you're saying we need to go after their wallets?" "Exactly," Langston said. "We know who some of these donors are, high-profile alumni who have made their fortunes in industries that are under increasing scrutiny for their lack of diversity. If they start publicly pulling back their support, it's going to cause a ripple effect." Jamal thought for a moment. The more he considered the idea, the more it made sense. He was fighting for a cause that transcended his own personal struggles, and if he could leverage the financial weight of the university's donors, it could change the entire conversation. "All right," Jamal said finally, "let's do it. But we need to make sure we're strategic. We can't just send a tweet and hope for the best. We need to find the right allies." The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Clara began reaching out to alumni networks, especially those associated with social justice, diversity initiatives, and civil rights. Langston worked behind the scenes, leveraging his own connections in the activist world, making sure the message reached influential people. Jamal focused on his interviews and public statements, carefully crafting his narrative to present a united front. It wasn't long before a handful of key alumni came forward in support of Jamal's cause. They were respected names, business leaders, philanthropists, and high-profile figures who had made their fortunes in industries often criticized for their lack of diversity. Their public backing created ripples across the university and beyond. They didn't just support Jamal's suspension being lifted, they demanded a full review of the university's diversity and inclusion policies. The administration, which had once been so confident in its ability to control the situation, found itself on the defensive. Dean Watterson's usual calm demeanor began to crack, and the Board of Trustees was faced with an unexpected dilemma. How could they continue to defend their position when prominent alumni were threatening to pull their financial support? Then came the tipping point. An article appeared in the New York Times. It detailed the growing controversy at Westbrook, profiling Jamal and the protests, and focusing on the administration's refusal to address the core issues of systemic racism and exclusion. The article also highlighted the list of influential donors who had begun to speak out. It was clear that the university's reputation, and its financial stability, were at risk. The public outcry reached a fever pitch. Students from other universities held solidarity protests, social media exploded with calls for justice, and the national media couldn't ignore the story. For the first time, the Board of Trustees found itself under real pressure. They couldn't just ignore Jamal anymore. Jamal sat in his apartment that evening, watching the news coverage as his phone buzzed with notifications. It felt surreal. He had fought for so long, and now the university was in a position where it had no choice but to respond. But there was still one hurdle left. The vote. The final vote on his expulsion was looming, and everything was riding on it. Jamal knew that if they expelled him, it would set a dangerous precedent for students everywhere. It would say that speaking out, challenging the system, was a fireable offense. But if they allowed him to return, it would be a victory not just for him, but for the larger movement he had sparked. Clara and Langston had been by his side through it all, and they were more determined than ever. The next few days would be crucial. The university was backed into a corner, and Jamal knew it was time to take one last stand. If he could win this fight, it wouldn't just change his life, it would change the trajectory of higher education itself. The tension in the air was palpable. Jamal sat with Clara and Langston in a small back room of the university's administration building, waiting for the final vote. They were all too aware of what this moment could mean, not just for Jamal, but for countless students across the nation who faced similar battles within the walls of academia. The protest had grown louder in recent weeks. The national media was now covering the story non-stop. Universities across the country were taking notes, and student activists were watching Jamal's every move, seeing him as both a symbol and a hope for the future. Every decision made now, every word spoken, carried a weight that none of them could ignore. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He'd fought hard to get to this point, but now, more than ever, the pressure was overwhelming. The protests, the alumni who'd pulled their donations, the articles in the New York Times, everything had led to this. And yet, even though it seemed like victory was within reach, he couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. The Board of Trustees, the people who held the power, had yet to take a stand. They had been in secret meetings for days, deliberating behind closed doors, and now it was time for the final decision. Clara sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the door. "It's not over yet, Jamal. We've come this far. We've got more power than they realize." Langston stood up and paced the small room. "It's true. The board might think they can make a decision in a vacuum, but they can't ignore the tidal wave that's already hit. This is more than just you now, Jamal. It's about every student who's ever felt powerless. It's about the future of higher education." Jamal nodded, but the weight of the situation still felt heavy. I just hope it's enough. I don't want to lose everything I've worked for." "You won't," Clara reassured him. "Not if we stick together." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Students were chanting and waving signs, demanding that the university reinstate Jamal. The protest had escalated into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Jamal wasn't just a student anymore, he was a voice for change. Inside the conference room, the board of trustees was gathered. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the members discussed the next steps. Jamal had been notified earlier in the day that he would be allowed to speak before the board before the final vote. His presence, however, was not welcomed by all. Dean Watterson sat at the head of the table, his face grim, while Professor Edwards sat beside him, looking stern as ever. Jamal had come to realize over the course of the past few weeks that the people in power at the university weren't just defending their decisions, they were protecting their legacies. The stakes were not just about Jamal's future at Westbrook University, they were about how the institution would face an evolving world that demanded change. The door opened, and Jamal walked in. He was calm on the outside, but his heart pounded in his chest. Clara and Langston had insisted on coming with him, and they were seated behind him, ready to offer support. The board members were already seated, their eyes on him as he took a stand at the front of the room. Jamal cleared his throat. The room fell silent, and for the first time in days, everything seemed to pause. This was the moment. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice strong, not just as a student, but as someone who believes in a vision for a better future for every student who walks through the doors of this university. "I didn't choose to fight this battle chose me. But what I've come to realize is that it's not just about my fight. It's about all the students who have come before me, and all the students who will come after me, who have been silenced, ignored, and marginalized." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the eyes of the trustees one by one. "I'm here because I believe this institution has a responsibility to evolve. It has a responsibility to embrace change, to confront the realities of systemic inequality that permeate not only our society but our academic institutions as well. The decision you make today will determine whether Westbrook University is a place of progress or a place that refuses to acknowledge the very real challenges that people like me face every single day." Jamal took a deep breath and continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I'm asking you, not as a student you wish to expel, but as a person who believes in the values this institution is supposed to represent: fairness, justice, and equality. I'm asking you to stand with me, to stand with the students, and to stand with the future. You have a choice. You can either uphold the status quo and silence voices like mine, or you can choose to do what is right, what is just, and what is needed." For a long moment, there was silence. The board members exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed impassive, but Jamal could see that his words had struck a chord. Finally, Dean Watterson spoke, his voice tight. "Jamal, your actions have caused disruption, and we cannot ignore that. We believe in freedom of speech, but your approach has challenged the very structure of this institution." Jamal nodded, trying to remain calm. "I understand that this isn't easy, but it's the reality we're living in. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. I'm not here to tear down Westbrook, I'm here to make it better, for everyone." There was another long silence. Jamal could feel the weight of the room upon him, and though he had prepared for this moment, it still felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Margaret Harrington, spoke up. She had been silent throughout the meeting, her face inscrutable, but now she leaned forward in her chair. "Dean Watterson, I believe we need to reconsider this situation. Jamal has raised some valid points. While his actions may have been unconventional, the spirit behind them is undeniable. We can't ignore the fact that students like him are asking for something bigger than just an individual case, they're asking for systemic change." Margaret's words hung in the air, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. But before he could process her statement fully, another board member, a man named Richard Blake, spoke up in opposition. "This is a dangerous precedent," Richard argued. "If we start giving in to protests like this, we risk undermining the integrity of our institution. We have rules for a reason." Margaret turned to him, her voice unwavering. And we also have a responsibility to uphold fairness and equity. We can't be afraid of what's necessary for growth. Jamal felt the tide beginning to shift. The board members were no longer a united front. The cracks were showing, and Jamal's words had made them visible. The vote came soon after, and Jamal, Clara, and Langston waited with bated breath. It felt like an eternity before the board members cast their votes. When the results were finally announced, Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. By a vote of 6-4, Dean Watterson announced, "The decision has been made. Jamal Carter will be reinstated as a student at Westbrook University." A rush of emotion hit Jamal like a tidal wave. He had won. The fight was over, for now, but it wasn't just his victory, it was a victory for every student who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been ignored. As he left the room, surrounded by his friends and supporters, Jamal knew this was only the beginning. The real change was just starting. Jamal stood outside the university administration building, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The cool autumn breeze brushed against his face, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were racing, his mind processing the vote, the emotions, and the knowledge that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was something bigger, something that could change the future for every student who felt marginalized, silenced, or oppressed within the academic system. The board's decision had been close, 6-4, but the outcome was undeniably clear: Jamal had been reinstated as a student at Westbrook University. His expulsion had been lifted, and the protests that had erupted in the wake of his suspension had found a moment of triumph. The tide had turned. For the first time in a long while, Jamal allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Clara and Langston were walking beside him, both wearing expressions of disbelief and joy. Clara's face was lit up with a radiant smile, while Langston kept looking back over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to change their mind. "We did it," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe we actually did it." Langston let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I knew we could. But damn, that was close." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "It wasn't just me. This was all of us. We wouldn't have gotten here without the support of everyone, students, faculty, alumni, even the press." Clara nodded. "It wasn't just about you, Jamal. It was about all of us, standing together. You were just the spark that ignited everything. But the fire needed to burn bright. And burn bright it did." For the first time in weeks, Jamal allowed himself to relax. The adrenaline had been running high for so long, and now that it was over, at least for now, he felt an immense sense of relief. But he knew better than to believe that everything would be smooth sailing from here. The victory was significant, but it was only a step in a much larger journey. As they walked through the campus, Jamal noticed the students around him. Some were whispering, some were congratulating him, while others simply stared, unsure of what to think. The energy was different today, more charged, more hopeful. His fight had sparked a conversation, and that conversation was far from over. The next few days were filled with a whirlwind of interviews, media coverage, and visits from faculty members who expressed their congratulations. Some were genuine, others less so. Jamal had learned long ago to be cautious of flattery, especially from those who had been silent when he needed them most. But there were others, professors and staff, who had quietly supported him from the beginning, and their words of encouragement meant the world. Jamal knew that his battle at Westbrook wasn't truly over. The decision to reinstate him was just the beginning of something much larger, something that had the potential to reverberate across the entire academic world. Jamal had become more than just a student, he had become a voice for change, a symbol of resistance against the institutional forces that sought to silence those who dared to challenge the status quo. As he sat down for one of his first post-victory interviews, he found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. This journey had been painful at times, but it had also been illuminating. He had learned the true meaning of resilience, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Jamal, your story has resonated with so many, the interviewer asked. What's next for you? Do you have plans to continue your education here at Westbrook? Jamal looked directly into the camera, his expression thoughtful. I'm not done yet, he said. There's still so much work to do. My fight at Westbrook isn't just about me. It's about every student who has ever felt overlooked, every student who has ever been treated like they didn't belong. The fight for equity, for fairness, for justice, those battles don't end with one victory. They continue, every day. And that's what I'm committed to now. The interviewer nodded, impressed by his conviction. And do you think the university will change because of what's happened? Jamal smiled softly. I hope so. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. What happened here at Westbrook is a reminder that institutions, no matter how powerful, are not above accountability. We've shown that we won't stand by and let things continue as they are. Change is coming. As Jamal prepared to return to his studies, the campus was buzzing with anticipation. The board had promised to review its policies regarding diversity and inclusion, and Jamal was determined to hold them to their word. He had already begun organizing meetings with professors, faculty, and students to ensure that the conversation didn't die down. This wasn't just about one student's reinstatement, it was about fundamentally changing the way institutions of higher learning approached issues of racism, inequality, and exclusion. But even as the work continued, Jamal couldn't deny the pride he felt. The victory was his, but it was also shared by everyone who had stood with him. It was the culmination of years of struggle, of hard work, of sacrifice, and most importantly, of standing up for what was right. The journey ahead would be long. The road to true systemic change was never easy, and Jamal knew that there would be setbacks, challenges, and resistance. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had made a difference. And in doing so, he had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished. As he walked across the campus, his eyes scanning the faces of the students around him, Jamal realized something: he had found his purpose. It wasn't just about getting an education anymore. It was about making the world a better place, about fighting for the voiceless, about pushing for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of an institution like Westbrook University and know that they were welcome, that their voices mattered. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And that was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?